You know.
Yeah.
So,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Hi guys. So yeah, kind of the what precipitated this, Nate and I have had some conversations, Shari and I have had some, and Nate was commenting on some of my appearance on your radio show. We started talking about AI, and it seems this was only maybe 2 months ago, and things have rapidly come on so fast since then. And now, of course, here we are embroiled in the current thing, which is AI, and we all have to talk about it, and we have to be either alarmist about it or we have to be more tempered about it. But this seems like it's more the rapidity of this happening in terms of, chat GPT and chat GPT-4 and all of the noise around that. I think it necessitates conversations like this. So Nate reached out and wanted to chat with you, and I'd say I'd love to have that conversation on here. So this is kind of Grail Country, Neighbor's Choice, Rooster's Crow collaboration here to just talk through the title I put there was in the machine and not of it. And just to frame it generally before Nate, I'll throw it to you, to get more specific. But there's these two kind of views, right? Paul Kingsnorth, who some of the information that we shared there, and you guys had a conversation. One of the quotes he had in his recent piece, he said, the sacred and the digital not only don't mix, but are fatal to each other. They are in metaphysical opposition. So that's his position. Right. And then there's the other side where, we are all descendants of the lineage of Cain, right? And ultimately city builders and metallurgists, right? And the end of that story from a biblical perspective is the New Jerusalem, which is a technical thing, right? Noah's Ark is a technical thing, right? So what is this? Where is this balance? Where's our roles as Christians to play in this rapid onset of technological progress? It's going even faster. And I know Nate wanted to frame it as well in a more Girardian sense to get your position there. So
well,
Nate,
I thought it would be helpful since David is Girardian. I think that there's a bridge to be built between Kingsnorth's concept of the machine and Elul's idea of technique and Girard's idea of mimesis. Because I think, especially for Elul, because Elul, he flat out says that technique begins with the fall. So there's something about, and when James just sent out a new tentative title for the video, which is, instead of the original title he sent out, it said something about the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And I think that's kind of putting us on the right path, because I think the question is, I think Kingsnorth, his inclination is to just think that science itself is a problem, rather than to think the possibility that science is a problem because of its paradigm. And that if the paradigm were shifted, then science becomes a solution and not a problem.
Before we dive in, why do you think Kingsnorth, I've never heard him talk about science as a problem.
Well, he talks about technology. Like he doesn't seem to have any room for optimism about technology at all. In the way, not as I read him.
Okay, well, I think that there's I'm just going to make this distinction. Maybe I'm wrong, okay, but I think there's a distinction between techne and digital technology for Kingsnorth. Techne is our ability to create, yes, right? Which we do. And, he's made mention of the Amish as having used technologies, techne, that don't interfere with their communal life or their religious life. Okay. Mm-hmm. So he makes a distinction between techne and digital technology. And I think the reason for that is one has to do with the ease with which we toil, and the other has to do with consciousness. And those are two big different arenas.
Yeah, I understand that, which is why we kind of landed on the cathedral as the sort of model that we wanted to use as a metaphor in that conversation. But
yeah. But from what I'm reading in the last two essays from Paul Kingsnorth, he's not so much worried about technology as such, but digital technology as consciousness and how it changes our consciousness. And I'll just toss this in here really quick before I jumped on. I was listening to McGilchrist on Unheard. If anybody hasn't seen it, it's really good. And he essentially says the same thing. They touch just briefly on technology, but because I'm going to try to summarize what he said about why things have accelerated so quickly towards this more analytical way of being in the world. He brackets romanticism as a reaction to it and an attempt to redeem the place that people were after the Enlightenment, right? But that failed. And so yeah, I think that a lot of people are stumbling into this as a giant technology, like just technology. But I don't think the worry is so much, like for McGilchrist and for Kingsnorth, the worry is not so much about techne as it is about digital technology that is changing consciousness. And McGilchrist would say it's pushing us more to the left-brained paradigm, right, of analysis and so on. So yeah, just want to make that. I think it's important, that we're not just talking about all technology. We're not saying that you can't use a shovel.
Right, and that like Vervaeke's recent talk where he was talking about artificial intelligence, and he made this strange move strange to me move of equating.
Made a lot of strange
equating wisdom with reason on a one-to-one basis. What that misses is intuition.
Totally.
And the role of intuition in wisdom. And I was surprised to see him say that, because like Vervaeke in the past has seemed to be aware of the role of intuition.
I asked Joseph about it briefly, and I said, what is this definition of rationality that he's using? Because if it's what I think it is, I don't know why he's doing this, because he doesn't seem to be ever having pointed us in that direction, right? So, and Joseph said it was a slightly different, I didn't get a definition, but it was not exactly what I was, the average definition of rationality. But according to Matthias Desmet, what rationality does is it connects dots, right? So you could think about it in terms of building walls with no spaces in between. It's just brick on brick, right? And Desmet makes the proposition that with rationality, we actually wall ourselves in.
And brick on brick, that shows you direct. That's interesting. That's an interesting image that he says brick on brick, because that shows you directly the connection to the Babel mentality.
Yeah. I think that's
and the difference between construction and growth.
Yes.
Yeah, I think
what's the difference between construction and growth?
Building and something happening organically. Engineering, right? And something happening organically.
So what do you say?
Engineering a bad thing there?
I guess it depends. I guess it depends. If you need a bridge, you need an engineer.
Well, I would say it has to do with so I would say it has to do, David, I would say that it has to do with the openness to intuition. So if in the process of like engineering and building, you're operating only in accordance with the horizontal dimension, and you're not truly open to the vertical dimension, or you're trying to subvert the vertical dimension to put it under your own control.
Perhaps the optimal situation for those two things would be that you organically develop a need for a bridge and then you engineer it. Right?
I think we need to put out this, when you talk about building bridges and constructs, we have to think about the sacred origins of these things and root it in immurement, right? Which is something I like to talk about, not because it's a happy topic, especially on a Friday afternoon, but rather that fact that most of the, cities, foundations, and bridges around the world were always inaugurated with the living sacrifice, right? Entombed into the cornerstone that they would lay onto them, or they would be entombed in the immurement in the actual bricks of the wall. So when you look at the original construction of a building, it's always going to be in that sacred space of human sacrifice, and that's interesting to bring that into the conversation, because I still think to this, I still think to this day that that's the same logic behind technology as we understand it in the popular domain, which is that it's always mediated by sacrificial violence, right? We have to have science, but science sacrifices by its very nature. The CDC structurally is a sacrificial institution that uses force to create its veneer of a kind of global, monopoly of kind of transcendent authority on the subject in which they think that they have the claim to do that. Same thing with the FDA. These different things are all little institutions that are basically at the foundations. They're still human sacrifices, right? I mean, they don't necessarily do the same traditional act of sacrifice as we understand it. It's been completely
sanitized
because of Christianity influencing these cultures in the West. But you still have people in cages where assault and rape is rampant because they defied what the FDA said is food. And we still have people injured because of products that the other institution told us to take. We still have people sacrificed by the millions and billions, really, because of the kind of the power of these institutions and their claim. And there's something linked. This is important. There's something linked to what the popular conception of the experts is tied to the ability to violently subjugate and put down those who they deem necessary for the preservation.
Okay, so
of society.
I just want to toss this in here. I know, James, you want to say something, and I don't want to interrupt you all the time.
No, you're good. You're good.
But I've just got this thought because I'm just listening to McGilchrist, and he said, what's interesting about the left hemisphere is that it is prone to aggression and violence, especially when it needs to get its own way, right? When it sees it the problem with it is it's an expert. Okay, you could think of it as an expert, and it cannot see what it does not see. And so for it what it sees has to be defended tooth and nail, right? And it will become violent and aggressive in defense of the thing that it sees.
Well, it's sociopathic too, because it has absolutely no intuition, like by definition. Because it's not the part of our brain that is associated with the intuitive capacity.
Right.
So where does the information of intuition come from? When we have an intuition about something, where does that come from?
I would say it comes from the imagination. Yeah. That's what I would say. The divine imagination, from God's imagination.
But they could be, because like screens are very intuitive, especially for children, right? iPads and screens and phones, they pick it up like it's second nature, right? So
is that intuitive, or is that just user friendly?
I think that's why I think it's important to make a distinction there. And then I think David bringing up this idea of the sacrificial foundational founding of cities and buildings. I think that, so maybe there is this vertical dimension. Right, we're not stuck on the horizontal, but the vertical dimension is implicit, and it's not plugged into God. It's plugged into something else.
Yeah, the technology, the way I look at the modern conception of technology would be very vertically integrated in the sense of the false transcendence, right, of sacrificial structures. That creates this togetherness. We're all in it together. The new normal, we're all in it together. All this stuff. We have to do this together. I can't believe you're trying to jeopardize killing people if you don't go along with doing what we're supposed to all do together. That's a transcendence. Say when Jesus talks about, behold, I see Satan fall like lightning, on the anthropological level, that's the transition in history between that concept of the accuser being part of God's design for the world, falling down and losing its transcendence and becoming something, like you said earlier, a horizontal kind of thing in which it's not going to have that kind of enclosure in which myth can keep its kind of unanimous, togetherness and unity.
Well, that kind of like that false transcendence, or illusory verticality, which I don't think really is vertical, right?
No, I don't.
That would be tied to Steiner's idea of the Luciferic side of evil. And here it is, and you can see it in the artificial intelligence, these digital technologies. You can see it cooperating with the Ahrimanic.
The what?
The Ahrimanic, which
What's
is
that?
the more pure materialist, brutal side. That would be what Shari was talking about when she was talking about how the tendency of the left brain toward violence. So that
You could think about
there's a
it. You could think about it.
collaboration between these two sides of evil.
So Ahriman is the purely material, and Lucifer is the purely abstract spiritual, right? And them separated.
They're symbolized in the Book of Revelation as the beast, and then the little beast with the little horn that lives on the dry land. And also in the Book of Job as Leviathan and Behemoth. Leviathan lives in the water, Behemoth lives in the dry land. So the Luciferic is usually represented as living in the water. The Ahrimanic is usually represented as living in the dry land, and they have those qualities. So one is moist and warm, and that's the passions. The other is dry and cold and metallic. Just those are usually the descriptors. Technological.
And for Steiner, it's the role of the Luciferic is to turn you over to the Ahrimanic ultimately.
Steiner, who are you referencing?
Rudolf Steiner.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's like the role of the whore is ultimately to turn things over to the beast, right? As the beast kind of devours, finally, the whore as well.
Devours the whore, yeah.
But let's double click here on this. I had this up here as a reference. It's from Ruth Gaskowski, and Paul referenced this in his piece. It's titled "From Feeding Moloch to Digital Minimalism, Child Sacrifice, Kicking the Chair, and Forming Digital Detox Community." Let me just read a little quote here. He says, "We sense even at a gut level that something is off with the negative influence that digital devices are having on youth, that they are conduits for portable pathologies and mood manipulation. And when we get specific and ask what sacrifice the machine demands of our children in terms of their time, mental health, relationships, overall well-being, and basic connection to reality, the cost becomes striking and unacceptable. Stated in stark terms, we are sacrificing our children to a digital Moloch whose cruelties include slave labor, sexual exploitation, solitary confinement, addiction, depression, anxiety, and suicidality."
And self-mutilation.
Yes.
I'll throw that in there.
That's not good.
No.
Those things are not good. I could say that. I can't say a lot of things
it seems like its entire orientation is simply just toward desire. And that's because, ultimately it's because of the false story of freedom that we've told ourselves. So Tomberg says that, and this is why the machine is such a good thing to call it, right? Because the idea of a machine, it implies something that happens in accordance with automism, unthinkingly, that it just things follow their natural course. And our course since the fall has been toward greater and greater enslavement of ourselves by continuing to recapitulate that over and over and over again. And so Tomberg says that the only things that are really free are the things that seem impossible. And you will like this. You will like, because of your Girardian lens, David. I think you'll like this. He says what the things that are the things that are truly
we don't
free
do
actions
automatically.
are the impossible things, like loving your enemies.
Well, didn't you say it's the things we don't do automatically? I just want to double check that.
Right. Yes, exactly. They're the things, not only that we don't do automatically, but that seem impossible. Like giving up on violence, loving our enemies.
For me, what's cool about that statement is that one is machine-like and one is not. Automatic is machine-like.
Right.
Non-automatic is not machine-like, right? It requires wisdom and discernment.
So this is so now this is precisely, so this is where, what if there's a paradigm shift that can make our technology truly serve love, right, and lead to human flourishing, instead of serving the will to power and lead to more and more violence, then this is where this is exactly where this shift has to happen. So the question is, this is the question I would ask Paul: is there something about the digital that makes it impossible for it to be put into the service of a completely different paradigm, a science that, instead of being based on doubt and the will to power, is based on plenitude and love?
Yeah,
Well,
but
I think that's where the anthropology comes into play, because you have to have, this is kind of my line that I say a lot, which is that if you only have a theology of Jesus, then you don't have an accurate understanding of what Jesus was up to and is up to in history. And so therefore you're kind of feeling around in the dark. And I think one of the things that comes with a proper anthropology, seeing through the eyes of Jesus and understanding what he was up to and revealing the nature of human conflict and desire and all these things, is that you're more, you have a hermeneutic of suspicion towards a lot of the institutions that you are given as, okay, this is settled, right? And that word settled has now finally been colored as something suspect for the first time in a long time in popular imagination. But my point is that instead of just being in a conspiratorial sense suspicious, but just being more intellectually suspicious of claims of prestige and these different kind of textbook knowledge things we inherit, like I tackle physics, all right, because I think my theory, I call it the Mowgli effect, is that when the atom bomb dropped, right, this world destroying fire drops, the world takes notice, and they say, my God, what kind of priestly knowledge could create something that could destroy the whole jungle? Just like with like Mowgli, he was mastering the kingdom of the animals because he alone could control the fire. They didn't know what to do with it. And I think that froze in time fields of physics, like relativity with Einstein and, quantum physics, they kind of got frozen in time as, okay, these are prestigious. We're not touching these. We're going to try to find some kind of way to glue them together with string theory, whatever, but that's the closest we're going to go. We're not going to actually challenge some of the foundational assumptions of these fields of knowledge, because it's a mimetic prestige that it was given, right? Because they have the power to blow up the whole world. There's a kind of human need to say, okay, we're going to tie this up. And I'm not even getting into, what governments were thinking in this line of thought. I'm just taking the basic level of kind of the sociological impact of this event. And I think it retarded our scientific knowledge dramatically, because we had already started building these institutions that were going to monopolize government scientific funding of advancements. But now they were going to be built under the edifices of relativity and quantum, which I don't think earned their prestige through actual evidence, but rather a lot of mimetic prestige that was given, that I think is a little bit of political, foundation to it, with the need to, who won World War II? The West won World War II, and these are the fields of knowledge that gave us the ability to destroy the world over with this terrible fire of the atom bomb. I think that what that happened, it's not a coincidence that that's where all of the slowdown starts to take place, because you get the 1950s and 60s, and they're dreaming of the Jetsons and all that, and they're dreaming of all these great things, but it just, nothing ever really pans out, because you're running off of the fumes of misplaced prestige on these institutional, dogmas of physics that are not accurate. And once they're not accurate, all that, Thomas Kuhn talks about this idea that paradigm shifts happen not because, people just are rational. I mean, people accept these ideas and paradigms not because they rationally go through all the evidence, but they accept it by faith. And I think the only way you could poke holes and start to lose the faith of those paradigms faster is if you had a population that was more anthropologically grounded in how to look at the world with suspicion, the way Christ looked at the world of institutional power and its sacrificial power with suspicion as well. Does that make sense? If you
Yeah,
keep that same frame of mind, you'll see it, and it will help you like not waste your time.
Effectively,
you
they
know?
just became a new priestly caste. Like that's all. That's what happened.
And Kuhn says that paradigms happen ultimately when the priests die. He says the paradigm shifts when the old guard literally perishes. You know, we're stuck in kind of the boomer, you know, generation having kind of a stronghold on all of the institutions, and we're seeing those kind of crater and fall. Do you think that there's a correlation there? How
You
know,
actually really think that the boomers have
well,
a
in
hold
terms
of
of
the institutions? I don't know.
well, is it who is it? Is it Generation
Honestly.
X? You
No,
know,
it's definitely not Generation X, buddy.
so who is it then?
We control
That's
nothing.
his-
Yeah.
We're the middle children of
I'm
history.
close to the boomer, you know, I'm
Well,
like, wait a minute.
like Rupert Murdoch, he's in his 90s and he's still running the Fox Media Corporation, right? We saw what he did with Tucker, right? You know,
Yeah.
multinational corporations, large institutions, banking
maybe
institutions,
in those, yeah, maybe further up.
academic
further up.
presidents, administrations like that. Look, we have a octogenarian president, and probably another one looking to come behind him. So those are the priests of the stifled advances that I think you're exactly right, David. I think we saw a huge increase in the early 20th century of the innovations made in theoretical physics, and we just thought it was just going to keep skyrocketing like that. Is there a correlation you think here with AI, right? Because if things aren't oriented appropriately, and you have a priestly class that is stifling innovation, is that applicable to what's happening with this hockey stick of artificial intelligence progression? Is this something that's going to plateau as well? And I think John Vervaeke talks about this, and then we're going to be able to make sense of it easier, or things of that nature.
I think that, one of the reasons, so it's not just that they're a priestly caste, it's that when they give you no results in atoms, all the money and all the attention and all the efforts and brightest minds are going to go into the world of bits. If the world of atoms can't get anything going any further than what, we've reached the end of history of understanding atoms and how to manipulate them in a way that creates a post-scarcity reality. Oh, that's not really going to happen. We're just going to be stuck with our garbage, our garbage subways, falling apart. We're going to devote all of our attention and effort to this digital world. All the money, all the great bright minds, young people are going to go into how can I make an app or an algorithm, rather than how can I create elemental transmutation at room temperature? How can I create nuclear energy at room temperature? How can I create anti-gravity? Is that real? Oh, no. We've already got it all. We've already got it decided that it's relativity and quantum, or you can do string theory if you like that, but none of that gets you anywhere. And so all the people who get into that, just all they do is come up with equations and all these different modelings that don't get anything done, because it's not actually incarnational physics. It's not accurate. So it's not going to, you're just going to be in a house of mirrors all day, and nobody has the mimetic courage to come out and say, no, I don't buy that, because you're completely blacklisted as a crank or, a fringe if you challenge these things. And so therefore nothing happens, and all the concept of technology right now. That's why I don't really care about the AI thing, because I think it's just a symptom of this pseudo-Gnostic, disembodied gospel that we have in our society, that the establishment has hijacked for their own purposes with wokeism and victimism, right? Like, we can get these things back if we believe with childlike wonder that the world is still filled with a lot of unknowns in the physical world, and that we can reach a post-scarcity outcome. I think that's something that we should think, but nobody thinks that way. I'm saying this and nobody thinks that way. Nobody thinks what I'm talking about is real.
I think that's
interesting, David.
That's not a bug. That's a feature. No, real quick. That's not a bug. That's a feature of the system. You're exactly right. If you're innovative, you're creative, you get into academia or whatever institution it is, you're going to be pipelined and specialized. And in order to gain any, advancement, you have to follow these specific rules and outlines that are going to stifle your creativity. So where does that leave us in terms of, parallel structures we've talked about before, or how do we, I think it's already happening. how do we shed more light on, and I think, David, you're doing a great job with this, with these innovations that are quote unquote on the fringe. Is it the Kuhnian idea? We just got to wait for this priestly class to die off. How do we focus more on what you're talking about?
Well, the way you do it is, I think what has to happen is you have to talk about it first. Like, you have to be able to speak about it in a way that kind of gives it mimetic prestige. I know I keep using that word, but you want to talk about the Girardian lens, so I'll frame it that way, which is you have to get enough people to say, okay, it's cool to talk about anti-gravity in a way that's not cranky or not ironic. That's the problem. Everybody thinks everything's ironic. And it's interesting, like Alex Jones is the only person that talks about radical technology breakthroughs being possible besides me, but he talks about it in the sense that they're all being suppressed by the globalists, which creates this big other, right? Which makes you never get out of your your apathy, right? Because it's a kind of controlling the person. I'm not saying he intends it that way, but when we got all these great technologies, but all the inventors that create them, they always get poisoned and die. Okay, well, if that's what you tell yourself, you will always stay on the master's plantation. You will never go past the tree line, because you're always going to be told by a fellow person enslaved that, oh wait, if you go out there, there's malaria, because it's a swamp out there. There's another plantation a few miles down the road, and that guy's even more brutal. There's all these different things that justify, let's just stick with what we have. And that's the same thing you hear all the time. Every time I talk about this stuff, and I won't say, I'm kind of overstating the criticism. There really hasn't been a lot of criticism. It's just that I see that kind of thinking criticized with these kind of assumptions that are baked into our online conversations. Like if you say what I said, like, hey, let's cure cancer, they'll say, oh, you're a tech bro. That sounds like learned helplessness.
Mm-hmm.
Learned helplessness.
Mm-hmm.
Because everybody still believes either one, basically the establishment line. What does it mean to solve cancer? It's basically whatever the American Cancer Society is researching, immunotherapy and all these things that cost $1 million bazillion. It couldn't be removing seed oils and other things like that out of the diet. It couldn't be something so simple that can't be patented. See, our whole brain, our whole process of thinking has been skewed towards things that can result in a patent. So you can't even talk about, oh yeah, take an aspirin for this disease. Oh, that's a generic drug. That's outdated. That can't possibly provide a solution to something I need, which is a substantial disease I need cured. These things can't be talked about,
So when I'm listening to this, I can't help. Here it comes, Nate. Are you ready? I'm
ready. Lay it on me, Shari.
I can't help but think about George MacDonald. So we're going through this essay, and I quoted this at the last Meditations on the Tarot, and I'm going to do it again, because what you're talking about right now is dogmatism versus imagination, okay? Or dogmatism repressing imagination, according to George MacDonald, okay? And for him, it's the only thing that represses imagination. So I've heard you in that, what you just said, refer to inventing, thinking differently, going beyond the tree line, all those phrases that you use. That's imagination. Yeah. Okay. And the old guard and the boomer generation, or whoever you want to blame it on, that's dogmatism. Okay. Repressing imagination. I mean, even Peter Thiel has said, we haven't done anything new forever, right? So I'm just going to read this, not just short. He says, all that has been said that then tends to enforce the culture of the imagination, but the strongest argument of all remains behind. For if the whole power of dogmatism should rise against the imagination, she will yet work, and if not for good, then for evil. If not for truth, then for falsehood. If not for life, then for death. The evil alternative becoming the more likely from the unnatural treatment she has experienced from those who ought to have fostered her. The power that might have gone forth in conceiving the noblest form of action, in realizing the lives of the true-hearted, the self-forgetting, will go forth in building airy castles of vain ambition, of boundless riches, of unearned admiration. The imagination that might be devising how to make home blessed or to help the poor neighbor will be absorbed in the invention of the new dress, or worse, in devising the means of procuring it. For if she be not occupied with the beautiful, she will be occupied by the pleasant. That is, that which goes not out to worship will remain at home to be sensual. Cultivate the mere intellect as you may, it will never reduce the passions. The imagination, seeking the ideal in everything, will elevate them to their true and noble service. Seek not that your sons and your daughters should not see visions, should not dream dreams. Seek that they should see true visions, that they should dream noble dreams. So, yeah, because when you were talking there, I'm just going, oh, you know, this is dogmatism repressing the imagination. And he uses the example earlier on in the essay of Lady Macbeth, who thinks that she can will herself away from her imagination, right? And she and Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment is also a good example of this, where they devise a plan that seems perfectly rational. And you can look at it from outside and say, yeah, that is rational. Why shouldn't he kill that old lady? She's terrible. She's a terrible person. But what happens is the imagination comes back to haunt them. Because essentially for him, when he talks about imagination, he talks about divine imagination. It is there in which we live and move and have our being, right? So anyway, I just thought that was interesting in regards to what you were saying, because if she cannot go out to worship, she stays home to be sensual.
Mm-hmm. So staying home, would that be going into the mind and the kind of mentalism that this bits dominated concept of technology has created? Like, it's no coincidence that we're doing the whole gender deconstruction thing. And I call it a false Gnosticism, right? Because it's like, it's still materialistic because, you know, it's built on that edifice of materialism, but it's like this kind of mentalism where everything it's reflective of the digital virtual world that we're in, right? Create your own avatar, create your own disembodied experience. Is that what you're suggesting? Is staying at home, is not to go outside and say, hey, let me go in my garage and let me see if I can tinker around with magnetic coils the way Nikola Tesla did. Like, is that what you mean?
Yes, that's what I mean, because essentially he uses Goethe a lot as an example, and a very simple example of this is his Goethe's Metamorphosis of Plants, right? So Goethe spends hours staring at a plant, following the lines of the plant, the limitations, right? The boundaries of that plant. The plant cannot exceed its boundaries. It's contained within this thing. So like if you think about the whole identity crisis thing that's going on in our young people today, right? And he allows that to be good and true and beautiful. He sees it as it is, given by God, okay? And he follows the lines of that boundary until he comes to the conclusion that it's the leaf that actually becomes the flower. And that's a scientific discovery in the end, okay? That wasn't known. So this is why seeing things as they really are, in that sense, is a world that is enchanted and filled with imagination. Mm-hmm. And when you do not see the things as they really are, you lack imagination. And It's really hard for us to see it that way, because it requires you being on your head and seeing everything upside down, you know?
So I think, Shari, you kind of hit on, like, so this might be why, and I think you can build a bridge between David's sort of technological optimism that seems to be focused on things that are actually incarnated, and Kingsnorth's pessimism, because Kingsnorth's pessimism, I think, is mainly driven by the features of the digital, which seem to be all about like avoiding avoiding the true imagination, right? To create
Right.
to create something that's total
Precisely.
that's total artifice.
It's a
Yep.
simulation
A
of
pleasant
yeah.
a pleasant illusion instead of
It's
reality.
I love the metaphor. Instead of
Yep.
going out to worship, it stays home to be sensual.
Yeah, it reminds me of you know, instead of going out and being vulnerable, developing a relationship with someone, becoming intimate with them, right? You go into your screens and you have pornography, right? So it's all kind of mental machinations. What I think is missing here, what I think really came through, you were saying, Shari, like Goethe, when he's exploring the plant, he's engaging in communion with the
Right.
plant, right? So is it possible to engage in communion digitally?
With what? What are you communing with?
Just in general, let's say, right?
You mean
Could
like
we-
what we're doing right here, right now?
Mhm.
Definitely. I think so.
I think that because the church, okay, and there's a lot of ways to paint this, but just I think because the church refuses to imitate Jesus when all of its forms, they're always picking at the Catholics, picking at these guys, and the Protestants picking at those guys, and the Orthodox picking at these people about how great their team is, but they can't just imitate Jesus. And if they would take their anthropology serious and try to understand what does it mean when Jesus says the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone and it is marvelous in our eyes. What a beautiful thing that is. And then leaning into that intentionally and working within that. We've missed so much. And so now we're looking at the effects of, I don't know how many years you want to put the benchmark of being detached from incarnational Christianity. And we're looking at all the nightmarish, insane things that we've come up with as a society.
Well, here's a proposition, David, before you go further and I lose my train of thought. What is incarnational Christianity?
Well, it's imitating Jesus. So, like, what did Jesus do? He was healing people of their material needs as a down payment on his authority of being the true authority of the reality of what we're all in. That the author of this reality is loving, self-giving, and is fundamentally on your side and has a good disposition towards his creation, and in such a way that he would ultimately lay down his life to reveal to us.
You know, I would say, for me, St. Athanasius wrote a book called On the Incarnation. And he doesn't start with the nativity. He starts with the cross. Okay. And in those lectures, John Bear talks about the fact that Jesus shows us what it is to be God in the way that he dies as a human being. Okay. And I've thought about this for a long time, and it's still not 100% clear in my mind. And I honestly don't think it'll ever be, because it's so big. Athanasius talks about a young girl named Blandina who was crucified in the Colosseum as a Christian. She was like 12 years old, and she had been brutally tortured and raped beforehand. And as they watched, they being the fellow Christians in the arena who were next, watched her being torn open by the lions, they saw Christ. Okay. Athanasius makes those moments incarnation. And I think that's, and I've thought about it, like, what does that mean? Well, it means accepting death and dying and suffering. That's what it means. It means voluntarily giving yourself to it, right? And so it seems to me that all of our aspirations, apart from that, are directed at not accepting it.
Yeah,
Not
like a denial of death anxiety.
Denial,
kind of thing.
yes.
Yeah.
Death, denial of death, a denial of suffering, a wish for human flourishing, longevity, all
But
the rest, anti-aging.
I don't know. I don't know. That's an interesting thing because, and I do think that, it's true that we should war against death because death is an enemy that has been defeated, and we are to be Christ's body on earth until he has made an enemy of his.
Well, how
he has
did
made his
Jesus defeat it?
footstools. He
How
had
did
made his
Jesus
enemy a
defeat it, though?
footstool.
Right,
How
but
did he-
Sherry, the incarnation is not simply like the crucifixion isn't the only part of the incarnation. The proper way to look at the incarnation is to look at the whole story of the life. All of that taken
Of course.
together is
Of
what the
course.
incarnation is. So you have to look at the birth, the ministry, the
Right.
miracles,
Of course.
the
I
death,
agree.
and the resurrection all together.
But
Yeah.
how
constitute
does
how you're to
Jesus
think about the incarnation?
Let me
How
place
does-
this in real quick. Let me place this in real quick because I think it's really relevant and it'll speak to some things here. So the church fathers talk about how, the serpent tempted Adam and Eve and said, eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you'll be as gods. And he did, right? And he did eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and he was able to perceive the tree of life. But what did he see on the tree of life? But Christ crucified. And he fled from that, right? That information, he fled from that down the mountain, right? And carried us down into our material existence. But the cross is there at the beginning and it's there at the end. So I had this idea from the fathers that Adam, after eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, perceived the tree of life. And on the tree of life was Christ crucified. And he fled from that. That speaks to this idea of this relationship between the appropriate comportment towards mortality and death, and informing a way to live and be.
Well, I
but-
talked about this recently with Jess, and one of the things that came clear to me in that conversation was when you were talking about the automatic and, the thing that we do automatically. And Tomberg talked about that, right?
Which ultimately just enslaves us.
Right. And what do we do automatically? We shirk death and dying and suffering. Right? That's our automatic response, like what James just described, right? Adam running away, fleeing, right? What happens when we accept it? What happened when Jesus accepted it? He trampled it. Through death, he trampled death. There's, and I don't want to be I can get on this kick and it can sound very morbid. It's not what I'm saying. We have to accept our mortality. And I think when we do that, we automatically become, how can we have any hubris in that? How can we, if we truly accept the fact that we are limited, that our time is limited? People talk about this often, that they get a big wake-up call when they get a terminal diagnosis, right? Oh, suddenly, no more fighting with the spouse, and as many family dinners as we can possibly have, right? So, how seriously do we take this?
But I want to use the example you just gave about when you realize you're dying, or if you have an experience where you come face to face with your own death, and then it gives you and it returns you to an appreciation of where plenitude really is.
Yeah.
Because it directs your attention away from thinking that plenitude is pursuing my desire without limit or boundary.
Right.
So, but I still think that we have to, but David is still right to point toward plenitude being part of the Christian picture, and the miracles of Jesus, which are also part of the incarnation, I think point us toward that. So
definitely.
Yes, so I don't think that we have to make this. I think
it's
it's a
not
false
either or.
choice.
I
think it's a
don't think
false
so
choice.
either.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
it's a
I'm
false
trying to
choice
give-
to set those things up in opposition,
Yeah,
because I don't think they are.
Yeah, I want.
Yeah, I hope I didn't come across that way. I just want
I
to say
think
that's
I think one is necessary and not sufficient, right? Like the idea of the bronze serpent will heal you if you're able to look at it, right? You have to crucify
Yeah.
the flesh in order to get to the plenitude on the other side. And I don't think the difference between spiritual and material plenitude, once you get on the other side, is as important. But you have to go through that filter of crucifying the intellect, crucifying the flesh. I'd love to hear more about
You
that
literally
idea
can't
with
have.
technology.
You literally cannot have resurrection without death. Like death is a prerequisite for
Mhm.
resurrection. Conceptually requires death.
So
Like, why-
I accept my death. I accept it. All right. Where's it at? I get it. Like, sounds
I don't
good.
know. See,
accept
I
it,
think it's
you know?
paradoxical, and because I actually talk about death anxiety sometimes the other way, where
can be.
we live in this expectation that we have a finite time on this earth, and therefore we try to suck the marrow out of life in a way that is very survival of the fittest like, and mimetically aggressive, and cutting
Well,
people off
here's
in
a
traffic
question then.
because you've got this subconscious feeling of like, I've got a finite time, the golden days were my childhood, I've got to try to suck the marrow out of every little moment I have to try to remind myself of the golden age of my 20s or whatever your golden age was, high school. And so that is a kind of death anxiety where you're living under the domain of I'm dying, and you've accepted it, but yet it's a kind of paradox, because like you said, you're denying it in the moment, but you're still owned by it. And I think Christians should live as if they're eternal already, that death has been conquered, it's been defeated. We shouldn't accept it. We should be outraged at anybody who wants to bring a death spirit into our culture. But we should understand that you can't, like you said, I agree with this idea. It's a paradox because, you have to kind of accept, laying down your entitlement to want to hold on to your life as a way of kind of freeing yourself from the domain of death.
I mean, Jesus says, if you save your life, you will lose it. And that never became clearer to me as during the lockdowns. I was like, oh my God, this is like totally happening right now. People are losing their lives because they're trying to save them.
Mm-hmm.
And they're running away from death. That's what they're running away from.
But what were they? Like, what were the hospitals? But what were the hospitals animated by in the medieval times that the Christians built to help people who were poor, who were sickly? Were they healing? Were exactly
healing.
Exactly. Which is what Jesus told us to do, to be His body. Yeah.
Lord, have mercy. That is that statement is heal me. That's what that means.
So I think I have an anecdote that it kind of illustrates like a healthy relationship toward this. It was an anecdote that Jordan Daniel Wood shared with me in one of our conversations. I don't remember if it was on the one on his book, The Whole Mystery of, I think it was one of the conversation we had about his book, The Whole Mystery of Christ. And he was talking about like how his current role as a stay-at-home dad, how he had to deal with his own like fear of missing out that comes along with him being in that role of a stay-at-home dad, even though he's tremendously gifted intellect and is highly respected by very important people in this field, and still doesn't have a position within the halls of academia, and like his dealing with that. And one of the realizations that he came to is that our fear of missing out is just ridiculous in the long game.
Yeah, right? It is.
Because of the reality of the resurrection.
Yeah.
Right.
That's where
I'm kind of like, I think we need to hold, I don't think we want to like, I think we want to keep the tension. You do. That's where David is right, I think, in wanting to keep that tension.
Because like Peter Thiel says, people say the dominant spirit of our age is, what would you do as if this was the last day on your earth, or on earth, right? And that's what you were talking about when you get the terminal news. What do you do? How do you change your relationship structures, right? But then he flips it on its head and says, well, you need to live like this is the first day of like an infinite life that you're going to live on earth. Like you're going to live forever. Now live that way. Live each day as if you are going to live forever. Now, how will you conduct yourself? And I think that's an interesting contrarian pushback, right? On this notion of like, when you accept death, that's what brings out the best of you. But is that it needs to be held in tension with,
for me, it is
the cultivation of the earth, right?
Accepting that death is an acceptance of immortality. Because to me, death is
right.
birth.
Yeah, exactly. There is accepting death as final and ultimate is definitely a bad thing.
Yes.
And when I have my own, like, I don't want to call it a near-death experience because usually that's reserved for people that actually were clinically dead. But when I was 14 years old, I went into respiratory arrest and I was panicked and I was like, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. I was absolutely terrified. But then right before the paramedics arrive, I got to this place where I just had this feeling of warmth. And it was like, oh, I am going to die, but everything will be okay.
Mm.
And that's the difference. It's like like if you think, if you're looking, if your acceptance of death is the acceptance of death as victor, as this final word, as the ultimate say, that's not a good thing, I don't think.
No, that's not what I'm talking about.
Right.
At
I know
all.
it's not. I know
Yeah.
I know there's ultimately agreement underneath this. That's why I was
Yeah.
trying to, I was
Well,
trying to get there.
I think it's interesting. Like we're also talking about Nietzsche's eternal recurrence here, right? That's his notion of live every act that you encounter as if you're going to live it kind of forever, right? I think we're in a mindset now where the idea is that there's life after death would be terrifying.
So, James, I got to push back just really quick on that, because I actually think this is the resurrection breaks the idea of eternal recurrence, because that is actually, that is the pagan model of reality.
Yep.
It is the eternal recurrence, that it's just an endless cycle, right?
Mhm.
That you go from the Manvantara back into the beginning of the next age, and it's just an endless loop. It's a closed circle reality, whereas Christ represents the world of breaks the world of the closed circle entirely forever, and shows that that is not the pattern. Resurrection completely breaks that pattern altogether.
I agree. And I agree with that. And I think we're exploring this tension here between these two views, but in the state of the nihilism and the kind of the inherent skepticism of our world, like, they have euthanasia and now, assisted end of life treatment. Imagine being in that state, you're not a believer, right? And then coming to the realization that there is life after death, and you're suffering and you're miserable. It's like that is even more daunting, right? That there is something after life, and I'm so miserable here. I'm suffering so much now without being a believer. That's terrifying, because you have to infinitely go through whatever it is I'm going through now. So after death, it's still not over. It's still not over. So it's like that realization could go both ways.
I'd like to go back and answer the question. I think one of you asked me about what is incarnational truth and all that. What I want to go back to that, because I think it can help us here. So when I talk about like signs and wonders and Jesus healing people with their paralysis and blindness, he's getting his friends more fish in their nets. These are all material gains, right? And I put that out there just to kind of correct against, again, this disembodied spiritualism of Christianity, because these are down payments on his authority. And you can't get to the cross until you've done those down payments first. So, and I think that, we need to be able to live being willing to shoulder the cross, but also be willing to not be so heavenly minded that we're not earthly good, in the sense of like, we're supposed to meet people where they're at. And here's what I mean by this. So when we heal people of cancer, that is a teaching moment. That's a technology that allows us to teach a lesson about the nature of God and the nature of who we are and what we're supposed to be. It's a down payment on the defeat of death when cancer is obliterated in American and the world history. And when diabetes is cured, that's a down payment on the destruction of the stranglehold of death. When we can get to the point where every human being can have energy too cheap to meter powering their home, so they don't need to rely on the grid, and they don't need to rely on the wars that are fought over oil or all the fake green energy things that are creating all this redistribution. Well, when they can be free from that, that's a down payment on the God that's outside of the city, on the God Yahweh in the wilderness, outside of the domain of where they think power is held, right? And so those are all down payments, in my opinion, that the church needs to think like that, because that's how you're going to get folks to want to listen and to be catechized into the higher levels of spiritual discipline and truth. That's how Jesus started his ministry, is helping people have good wine, and that was a sign. And also that was rebuke of the eternal return and the pagan mindset, which said the best is at the beginning, right? The best wine is at the beginning. No, he says, no, the best is yet to come. The good wine's coming at the end of the party. And that means history's going somewhere, right? And that means that we have a responsibility not just to detach from, the mundane desire like Buddhism would say, but rather to engage and to usher in these different elements that can alleviate the effects of scarcity and create a teaching moment. That's why Rene Girard said we didn't stop burning witches because we created a scientific method. We discovered the scientific method because we stopped burning witches. In the gospel technology of being able to stop, using these violent forms of creating order and meaning in our lives, when we stop and pause away from that, we have a teachable moment to love each other in an area in which we didn't love each other. And then we have a way to actually alleviate the original problem, which was creating pressure, which resulted in the scapegoat murder in the first place. Does that make sense in what I'm saying here?
Yeah, I'd like to double click a little bit on this idea. I don't, every time these things come up, the miracles of Jesus and healing people, let's what does that ultimately mean? And the way that I came back to Orthodox Christianity was through Taoism, and I got really interested in traditional Chinese medicine, and I practiced Qigong, which is the way that you work with the master, right? And you have to practice Qigong yourself, which is the cultivation of love ultimately. And if you practice this cultivation, your students and the people that you treat, that love that you've cultivated through these, spiritual psychotechnologies that you encounter, that love is what heals people. So they actually have hospitals in China, they've shut them down now, Qigong hospitals, where you can heal cancer through these methods, developing the energetic functions of the body, right, and applying them. But it's interesting. Part of I remember reading from the book, like if you don't cultivate love for 3 days straight, it'll be diminished. Students will feel it, and then you won't be able to heal people. So it's a real actual technology. And I practiced hands-on healing for many years, and when I would do it, there would be crazy effects that I would feel, and people that I'm doing it with feel. And I would do it with my family all the time. I would do hands-on healing, and they would go instantly into a deep, deep sleep, and then they would start, making these twitchy movements, right? And there was this feeling that I would get, I'd feel on the bottom of my feet, I'd feel saliva start filling my mouth, right? And I'd feel this energy kind of at the base of my hips, and it would be intense, especially if I did it like with my wife in a sense. And I don't know what's going on there, but it's something,
Well, it's an example of the marriage of heaven and earth, right? So if scientific materialism wants to only pursue earth, and like disembodied theology wants to only pursue heaven, and both of those ways are somehow wrong. Mm-hmm. And like the key feature of the gospel of Jesus was the kingdom. So as we have this conversation, I keep seeing the two questions keep occurring to me. What is the church, and what is its relationship to the kingdom? And what should we be doing?
Picture came to mind of an egg, right? As the church being the little body, right? And then the yolk being kind of the potential that's going to turn into the kingdom, right? The church is the body of Christ on the earth, right? And over time, right, just like a mustard seed, just like leaven, right, it rises up to create the kingdom, right? So, and that is the birthing of the kingdom of heaven, which is at hand, just like an egg when it's going through its process of hatching, right? It's metabolizing the nutrients and it's building its body, right? So the church that was planted by Christ, right, is a small body in a very large world. But the idea is through time, the Christian story will metabolize and give birth to the kingdom of heaven, which is already at hand, in a paradoxical way, because we are living in eternity right now, right? We are, whether we can aware of it or not, or whether we can become aware of it or not. So I think what the church is technically and what that's going to look like when you throw in these digital technologies, and then which church, what do you mean by church? Do you mean specifically the body of Christ? Do you mean the institution that's at war right now? And what do we mean? It's a good question.
I'm asking what we mean. Like
that picture came to mind, but what that can mean practically, technically moving forward, it's a good question.
Well, I mean, the church throughout its history has had a tendency to focus on like the theological heaven side of the equation, right? And I feel David, like a lot of what David is doing is kind of like pushing back on that, right? He wants to draw our attention back toward the material nature of like a lot of what Jesus is doing. And I think as Christians, I think our tenant, like you'll hear Christians like warning anytime anybody tries to suggest anything that looks like an attempt to do any kind of real kingdom building within material reality, they'll warn you about immanentizing the eschaton.
Yep.
But do we really think that that is the Christian story really just the story of a divine rescue mission in which we play no role?
Exactly. Exactly. We are his body. And so we are to do what he did when he inhabited his body on earth. So we should be healing people. We should be helping your fishing yield get stronger. We should be able to feed the 5,000 with, I think, like, I take that feeding of the 5,000 as a prophecy. I think he's talking about, I think he's performing, he's doing a performance art prophecy. He's showing that when you are my body on earth, you are going to manifest a reality in which you can feed 5,000 with 5 fishes and loaves.
Right. And he says, we'll
I
do
think
these
this,
things.
for me,
And he says, we'll do these things. And it's like, I realize, I understand the criticism of prosperity gospel, which prosperity gospel has like a seed of something that's right, which is this idea of like the hiddenness of the divine plenitude that's like right there for us if we only had eyes to see it. And it just subverts it to, it allows itself to become subverted by material desires. But there's a seed of something right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think for me personally, the problem is how to is scale. Like this is where I always have to go back to the principle of the one and the many, right? And I've talked about this not at length, but I think, you know, George MacDonald talks about this in the Hidden Life poem. He says that the saving power enters the one door, right? It's the thing that you have to let in. You as a person, as one person, you have to say yes to it. And then from there, it besieges 1,000 other doors. And this is the parable of the leaven, okay? It's what a pine cone or a dandelion does. It's one flower, and then it goes to seed, and it doesn't even move from its spot, okay? There are a lot of examples in nature of this happening. So the problem I see is that, and this is why I talk about trampling death by death and accepting your mortality, because I think that this is where the saving power enters the one door. It enters the one door when you come to terms with your own limitations and you see the good, the true, and the beautiful in them. And then you see the miraculous. Then you see the leaf becoming the flower, okay? And that powerful re-enchantment of your own life besieges 1,000 other doors. But if we want to build institutions, then we're immanentizing the kingdom, okay?
What is an institution? Just so I make sure I'm not trying to build an institution in this
What
context.
is an institution? Well, I have a lot of, I'm not going to say. I'm just going to leave it at that.
Well,
I don't
I
don't want to give anybody any.
This is important, Shari, because
I don't want to
important.
distract people.
Shari,
I don't want people to get distracted with what I judge an institution to be.
Right, but it's still
Okay.
it's an important question because it relates directly to the question I asked earlier about how are we to conceive of the church? Is the church an
Okay, so
institution?
this is, you know how we conceive of it? Incarnation. We are a body.
Okay, there we go.
Okay.
Which goes
We
back
are,
to the
and as a body, we are an incarnation, and
which
this is
brings
why
us-
St. Paul says not every part of the body is the hand, not every part is the foot, right?
So appropriately oriented institutions within the heavenly hierarchy.
Organic institutions that are invisible. Okay, that's my definition.
because it ties back to the distinction between building and growth that I was referencing earlier, and which
The
is
body
ultimately
is-
the difference between the kingdom of heaven and the Tower of Babel.
Right.
The
I think
the Tower of Babel is built brick by brick. The kingdom of heaven grows from seed.
Yes.
I think like our body in the West is like a paralyzed, severely paralyzed. And so that's why we've got all these crazy mentalistic ideas in our head about transforming our identity and our body
You
is
know,
given. We're just paralyzed with inaction.
I was listening
And
to
so,
McGilchrist
yeah.
this morning, and he said something really interesting because of the principle of the coincidence of opposites. If you pursue anything for any length of time, you will encounter its opposite. Okay?
Mhm.
If you pursue freedom, you will encounter tyranny. Think about that. So, and this is what we do as human beings. We say, "Oh, that's a great idea. Let's go for it." And I'm not saying we shouldn't. Okay? But like you said earlier, Nate, we need to learn to hold the tension. You know, when Peter walked on the water, when Jesus walked on the water because he can hold that tension. He understands the principle of the coincidence of opposites. And so the water becomes solid under his feet, even though it isn't. Okay? Peter jumps out of the boat, and lo and behold, he's walking on the water. Right? Until he thinks about it.
Well, I would say
Until he
Jesus.
realizes it.
Jesus doesn't just understand the principle. He's the incarnation of
Well,
the
of course.
coincidence.
Of course.
Like that's
Of
what
course.
that's what it means to be the God man.
Yes,
So-
and we have to hold that tension in order to walk on water, and that's a tricky place to be. Right?
Yeah, Sherry,
Terrifying.
it's interesting you brought up George MacDonald. I'm reading The Golden Key with my kids now, and it's
Oh.
a beautiful story.
Oh
You know,
my
the
gosh, yes.
the flying fish, and it's
The flying fish.
there's something about that story that makes you respect the idea, the Western idea of we're killing animals in vain and we're eating them. How could you do that? We should be vegetarians. That story shows you that if you do it appropriately, you're taking that animal into your body and it's becoming, you're transfiguring that animal if it's dealt with appropriately, in a sense. And
Mhm.
this idea of scale is always, I always butt up to that as well when thinking
Yeah.
about these things. And I made a quick video, is almost like a joke. You know, the answer to the problem of artificial intelligence. The good news is it's discernment and spiritual maturity. The bad news is the answer is discernment and spiritual maturity. Right. But the answer is in that tension, right? Is being able to hold that line, right? So
Mhm.
you think the idea is that just like Christ went down into hell, Jonah and the whale, right? It's you have to go to the belly of the beast to transform it. So just like Christ trampled death by death, can we trample technology by technology? Right? We're going to build this ability to scale the story
Apparently.
of Christ, right? We're building the infrastructure, but it's for despotic means right now, but it has to get built. And the only way it could get built in the current system that we have is through these fallen kind of lenses and understandings of way of building instead of growing, but that's going to get built. Right. So
see, I don't know. I think that again, this hunger to build all this stuff may be, I'm not saying it's for sure, but it may be a symptom of a body that's in despair because of feeling as if nothing can change in a good way. Like, I think if you cure the diseases, the need to tunnel into AI insanity goes away off the vine. You know, like it's just going to wither away. I think it's an outgrowth of dysfunction in the body. Like if you fix some of these areas that we don't even talk about, I don't know any church that talks about how seed oils cause diabetes. And I know people suffering with diabetes right now. And I'm like, why can't one church talk about it? Why can't one church, just that one thing alone?
Because they're not experts.
Exactly.
So I think we have to broaden the horizon of the understanding of what the church is, because you talk about it and you're talking about it to me and people will hear that. All right. So I think and I don't disagree, right? We could look at the body that we're building as becoming decrepit, or we could look at it as something that needs to be transfigured and transformed, right? That's Christ's story. He didn't come just to save humanity. He came to save falling nature itself, right? And the
Yeah, and he
impetus
did it. He did it. Sorry.
No, the impetus of technology, the essence of technology, right, is part of God's kingdom, right? And for the ability to have energy too cheap to meter, and the ability to access and provide resources with love to the entire population is made manifest quite simply with the technologies that we're building if we use them for those means. So I think, once it seems we're at the heart of tyranny, we have to have faith the transformation will happen, right, at that point. And then we could use the infrastructure, the wires, the cobalt, we could use that infrastructure for the good, or we're in a situation where we'll be dispersed again. And this isn't the end times. This is just another example of a failed attempt at building Babel.
Well, Babel was built when they tried to invent vegetable oils, because they were trying to replace natural fats with the space age fat of the future that would supposedly be better than what humans had been eating for thousands of years. And it ended up poisoning the whole world to such a degree we have no even comprehension the level of, it makes COVID look like nothing, nothing in terms of the carnage. But so that's, trying to build an invention to reach to reach the heavens. That's always going to be a problem. And that's one of the reasons why nobody wants to do what I'm talking about, because the moment I talk about energy too cheap to meter, people automatically think, oh, you're trying to build a Tower of Babel to heaven. It's like, well, yeah, because humans are going to do bad things, therefore we should never do anything to try to meet people where they're at. So therefore, let's just sit and where we're at and squalor. And I don't like that, because that's not what Jesus did. Jesus didn't sit around under the tree like Buddha and talk about transcending out of this terrible spot. He went out and dealt with people where they were, and he met them where their needs were. And that was atoms. He was doing stuff in the world of atoms, just like he was doing stuff in the world of the spirit. It was all incarnated, intertwined together. And the atoms are the down payment on the invisible world that you don't see.
Right.
Like,
and he preached the gospel of the kingdom, which is the coming together of heaven and earth, not a going to heaven.
Yeah. And I think another thing that needs to be brought into this is good art. Like you keep referencing McDonald. We need McDonald to do movies. We need more of those people doing stuff like that. We need to spark the imagination. Like I look at the budgets that Christians and so forth have to make films, and they make such oftentimes not very good works. And I'm like, if we could just have a renaissance, like what if good Christ loving and Christ haunted people and stuff were making great art again? Like, I know they're making it, but like really making it, like really stirring up the culture and really grappling with these mysteries and doing it in a way that can shape my generation with like this renaissance of art. At the same time, we have a renaissance of technology. I think all those things need to happen at the same time.
Well, but David, AI threatens art altogether. It threatens art altogether, because the problem is that this is actually okay. Because of our decision to essentially worship the market, like efficiency has become our ultimate measure of all things. So because of the fact that we have decided that efficiency is all that matters, we will accept a pile of garbage that is generated easily at almost no discernible costs by AI over anything that has any quality. Like already, like talking about movies, I was just talking to someone yesterday who has a friend who's actually like studying film, and he shared a whole bunch of screenplays that were really good screenplays that aren't getting made, right? Because Hollywood just keeps producing crappy movie after crappy movie after crappy movie. And it's not because they don't have good material, it's just they don't care, because all they want to do is to make the movie that makes them the most money. So it's better to make sequel number 7 to dumb action franchise than it is to produce the movie that actually has artistic merit. And AI is just going to make that worse, because then, you don't even have to employ any human writers at all. You can just tell AI, hey, write a sequel to whatever was last summer's big blockbuster hit and go to town.
Yeah,
and there's another problem, I think, too, in the film industry, is that there's a lot of things you can't talk about anymore. And a good screenplay is going to take you to places where you might be entering taboo territory, and there's way too much of it right now. Like there's just so much of it that, there's a really good film that's been put out 4 years ago called The Book of Vision, and you can't find it on any streaming platforms in North America. And it's about the patient doctor relationship.
Mm.
But sure, you make a really good point there, because good art doesn't, especially like, I had a conversation with Dr. Chris Green a while back about beauty and Christianity. And as Christians, we have to see Christ as ultimately the embodiment of beauty, the crucified one.
Mhm.
So what real art does is point us oftentimes toward things we don't want to look at. That's what real art does. But the pornification of our society has made it so that what we view as art now is whatever pleases us.
Right.
And the last
So
thing we want to be confronted with is anything that has the characteristics of real beauty, because it may want to lead us to look in places where we don't want to look, which, to go back to James's story, ultimately the thing we really don't want to look at is the tree of life.
yeah. And so instead of going out to worship, she stays home to be sensual. That's exactly what you just described.
And I'll push back a little bit on this idea that the big fear of AI is these deep fakes, right? And that it's going to create all this art. Like, if you watch a NFL game, right? Would you want to watch an NFL game played by AI robots that were optimized?
Definitely not.
It would make no sense. Or ballet or something. And there's something to the quality of the art that's going to get a lot better. But I'm not saying, if there's something, when you see this AI art, which is going to get, again, a lot better in AI movies, there's something there that doesn't have a soul, a heart. It's not going to be as attractive.
I've never found
we're running
any of it
to the limit of it.
Right. I've never found any of. I don't understand. Like, when I hear Scott Adams talking about how awesome AI art is, I don't know what reality he lives in or what he's looking at. Because it's like, do you have no aesthetic sensibility whatsoever? Because it's crap. It's all crap. None of it is remotely.
Well, it might be good for the left side of the brain.
Right,
It might be good, right? It's all structurally correct, and the colors are perfect, and all
exactly.
the
It's going to get technically better, but I think we're going to see the kind of limits of that. And like the whole deep fake situation where we're like, we're not going to know what's up and down, left and right. Society's going to crater even more on Twitter when information and stories are coming out that are just fake news, but look so real. We're already in that world, right? Photoshop was the same concerns happened with Photoshop, right? I don't think the deep fake aspect of it, I think these alarming are unwarranted.
I'm not so concerned with the deepfake so much as I am just like the pursuit of efficiency alone, which has just caused complete loss of any sense of real quality in our culture, will just drive us to just accept a mountain of crap even more than we're already doing it.
Do you think
AI is just going to make it worse?
Nate, do you think that you would be able to, do you think they could be able to make a AI created sequel to Passion of the Christ and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference?
John Vervaeke said,
I've never seen the original, so I can't answer.
You don't like
question.
the movie?
I haven't seen it. I've never actually watched it.
A lot of people describe it as really good in terms of its revelation about some of the insights of the Gospels and that experience. But
they are making a second too, right? They are making.
That's what I'm trying to. Yeah, they're making a sequel.
Resurrection.
And so in the harrowing of hell and all that. I'm just wondering, like, I just think the AI thing, maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's a little overblown. It's almost a little bit like Y2K for me. I don't think it's going to pan out as that big of a deal. It probably will really continually corrupt a lot of these already corrupted areas of our society, and it'll just kind of continue. But I think if we do the right thing, my thesis is that we break through with some wonders in the real world, and it will culturally move people mimetically to the real world. So you will play outside when you think that outside is still, like you were saying, enchanted. Once you believe the world's enchanted again, you won't stay in this cul-de-sac of insanity. You won't really care. You'll still have it. It'll probably keep going and it probably have its problems, but I just don't think it'll be all consuming like people fear if we have some enchantment in the physical world again, where because that's what we do. We need to come together. We need to have real communion, real flesh and blood body communion. We need to have that anchor all of our disposition towards the world. I mean, like, look, when I was a child, as a young age, we had there was an orange grove a friend of mine lived near, and he had real swords and axes and stuff, and we'd be going out and slicing oranges and battling things in our mind. And now they just sit on this smartphone the whole time. I'm like, why is that happening? Because we don't believe the world's enchanted anymore. Like you were saying that word, we don't believe it's filled with magic and hope and wonder. We don't believe we can do anything great in it. We don't think diseases can be cured without, giant government and insurance companies, creating these horribly painful side effect riddled horrible things. Like we don't believe anything that's powerful and beautiful and gorgeous and exciting anymore. So therefore we're just numbing our children out.
Some parents said to me the other day, as they were taking their 3 children down with 3 separate iPads so that they could each watch their own thing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Said, well, I know screens. I know. But, like you got these 3 kids all day long and, you just need some time out. And I said, yeah, well, I know some people who never give their kids screens, and they're the CEOs of all the tech companies.
Right.
Right.
Well,
So like, how dumb are you? That's really what I'm trying to say. Like, wake up. Okay. Just like in the King's North conversation, we said you're going to have to draw lines. And if you keep telling yourself, oh, I just need some downtime. I just suck it up, buttercup,
But the thing is,
like
is
find
it's such a
something
powerful,
for your kid to do, read a book,
Shari, it's such a powerful distraction though. It's like we're literally scrolling our smartphones and looking at what's on social media while our infrastructure crumbles around us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and
which is
we're
exactly
doing the same while we're yelling at our kids, but we're get off your iPad. You've been on it for an hour. Get off of it now. As you're texting, as I'm talking about myself, like you're talking about me there.
Yes, absolutely.
100%.
Guilty as charged.
So that's why I've got to be in the machine world, but
I met I'll give you an example. So in my media work, what I do is I look for on one of the side projects that I do. Well, it's not a side, it's the biggest project, but it's not the one that gets all the attention. Is I get to go around the country sometimes and meet interesting people tinkering around with great ideas. And the unfortunate thing is that the ones that have the most extraordinary, awesome pursuits of breakthrough technologies are all like 70 and up, and they're dying. And I've had a lot of them die since I've gotten to know them. And it's sad, right? Because I wish if I had known what this world was, I would have, when I was younger, applied myself to engineering and things like that, because I didn't know what we were headed towards. And now I do. And I'm like, man, and I still have time to learn those things. But I mean, these guys, like there's one guy, he was near 90 and I remember going into his garage, and he used to be an engineer, and I was filming him and showing what he was doing. And he was taking ordinary microwaves, and he was breaking beer bottles, grinding them up with black sand from New Mexico that he had. And he was creating these little kilns inside of microwave and creating a heat like a plasma. He was creating such a temperature in the magnetic fields, and he was pulling out what he believed, and I think he was right, because he was a trained chemical engineer when he was doing it for years. Little particles of rare earth elements like gold and platinum, things that are not supposed to be transmuted from other elements. That's not supposed to happen according to our standard model of physics. And I guess I never felt more alive than being a part of helping him do that. Like I felt like this is awesome. And it wasn't better than when I worked on a family member's blueberry farm when I was a young man. That was actually even more exciting. Like just to go to your organic thing, like watching little blueberries grow and seeing the ground get better and all this. That was so soul fulfilling. But it was almost the same feeling when I'm doing this experiment, believing in something audacious like, they've said you can't have elements go from one to another at room temperature. You need to have some kind of nuclear fusion like thing, like in the sun. And here he is showing me evidence, and I'm watching him in real time do it. And that's the kind of thing that I want to see people believe in more, but they don't know.
I think I hate to be the doomsayer that I am, but I just think good art, the spirit of invention, re-enchanted worlds, those all come about under pressure. Under pressure.
I would say something even more pessimistic. You have to get Antichrist before Christ.
Yeah.
You have to have Antichrist precedes the parousia.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
right. That's right.
What-
And that's why I think people have to get to that place where they can accept their mortality as a and not as an end, not as a final end, but as a you know, a birth, right?
And I think accepting your mortality also relates to social death. Like once you accept your social death, it's almost harder to accept that than it is to your physical death, right? To be
Social death.
excluded.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's like-
exclusion.
yeah, to be excluded, to be socially alienated, to not feel heard or understood when you're slighted in a mimetic moment of someone being rude to you or not understanding you or putting you down or belittling you or betraying you, that being able to not cling on to the pain that you're kind of, programmed to want to feel that in that moment, being able to let go of that and delight in the joy of the Lord is a way of overcoming social death, which prepares you to be able to overcome physical death, right? Like, because it's like, it's all the same matrix.
It's all the same. It's all the same. Yeah.
So here we're running up here. Let me ask one more thing here. Like, so my son, my 9-year-old, he was during Lent, so he gave up candy. I gave up alcohol, and it was great. But he found his iPad and all these videos of Jesus around Lent time coming up, and he kept watching them, right? Like, and how do we inspire their imagination that these things are possible? Like you're saying, of creating elements, except exposing them to that. And there's no physical people around us that are doing that. Those people are in the world, and our access to them is mediated through this technology. So there has to be some sort of comportment with this technology towards those types of people. And I guess let me ask like kind of a final question here. What would be an ideal answer from your perspective if you ask your small young child, what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want your children to be when they grow up? I know you have young children, David, like I do. What would be an answer there these days that would make sense?
To me, what would my answer be to children?
What would be an answer that you would appreciate hearing or want to hear, given that, where we're at, what's up, the institutions are like, what academia is like, what engineering is even becoming? What do we push our kids towards to help them?
I don't think it's about pushing them towards the career sense. What I would say is, don't touch the seed oils and the colors and the dyes and the foods, and get those iPads out of those kids' hands as much as possible, and allow them to see the world, go to museums more than you go to Disney World, or go to, go see how blueberries are harvested and let them pick them. Let them go work on a farm, at least a portion of the year or something. Like, just get them in the world where their brain, like I remember,
let them get dirty.
Yeah, let them have an imagination. Just don't try to tell them what to do. Just let them have an imagination. And when you plug them up to programming, you're killing the imagination. Number one thing, you're killing the imagination, because it's going to fill in all the plots and all the stimulation and all that without them. When you're bored and you're sitting at an orange grove, it turns into a mighty army to battle. Okay. And then when you get out there and you climb up on that tree, and now it's turned into a ship that you're steering with your brother, that's childhood. That's what creates the next Tesla. Is that moment. That's something that does that to the spirit. That's the number one thing. Don't tell them what to do. Just unleash them. That means you've got to be able to say no and put boundaries up about things which are going to limit their ability to develop who they could be.
George MacDonald says there's nothing greater for the imagination than doing good.
I like that.
Yeah.
My kids are grown, so.
Mine are too. Mine are too. And my grandchildren are all stuck on their devices. So I don't know. But I personally, I just think kids should get dirty. They should get really dirty. There's a beautiful story called the Velveteen Rabbit. If you must know it.
Yeah.
And my daughter made me my favorite excerpt out of the story. She framed it for me for Christmas this year, and it talks about how the rabbit knows, when you've been loved, when your eyes are falling out and your ear is torn and you're all dirty and you've been dragged through the mud, right? And
yeah,
and I mean
and-
that. Oh, go ahead.
Well, in that story, it's like love is the magic of the real. Like that's
Right.
what love is, the force that makes things real.
Yes.
Which I think, like, this is what I was trying to say earlier when I was talking about like shifting the scientific paradigm from one of doubt and the will to power to one of love.
Right.
That's why
And to love and be loved is
Love and
is-
faith instead of doubt and will to power.
Yeah, and to love and be loved, according to the story in the Velveteen Rabbit, means that by the end of it, you're just pretty worn out looking.
that's why I love football, coaching football, having my kid and kids around, just get dirty, just, you know, pile into each
Mhm.
other. They build brotherhood, they build love, they build camaraderie, and it's excellent. And I think jujitsu, another thing, getting kids early, just being close to the body, getting beat up a little bit, that cultivates this love that's going to be necessary. So I think you guys are right on there. So any last words here? You have taken you a little bit longer than our time allotted, but any last words, guys?
Well, I have a residual question that would probably that probably I don't want to bring up because it would keep us too long. But it has to do with robotics, because it's like, is robotics incarnational enough to redeem any of this digital technology? That's the question I would ask now, because we're pointing toward incarnation and embodiment. But does robotics do anything for us in that?
I'm going to go with maybe.
Okay.
Sure. I mean, if you have a robotic leg, you can walk again. That's pretty nice. You know, stand up vertical for once, right? I mean, it's not going to be the same, but
You know, they have these robotic priests now, Buddhist and Hindu and even Christian.
Okay, robotics
priests.
are out then.
Yeah,
hey,
those were featured in Paul Kingsnorth's latest essay.
Yeah.
And I showed
Oh,
those
gosh.
to my husband, and he was just like, "What?"
They're freaky. So, but anyways, ultimately, how do we stay in the machine but not of it? Do good and get dirty. Ultimately,
I love it. I love
yeah,
it. Nice
so-
summary.
Mhm.
awesome. So
Nice
thank you
summary.
guys. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
Thank you,
Yeah,
James.
nice to meet you
Thank you,
guys.
David.
Thanks, James.
Thank you
Thanks
for
very
your
Good to meet
much.
you,
time.
man.
Till next time. Bye.
Yeah.